Welcome to the 2024 Phish Studies Conference Video Archive. The Mockingbird Foundation is thrilled and proud to present this groundbreaking video series on our YouTube channel. It continues our tradition of celebrating music education. Since 1996, we have been an all-volunteer nonprofit organization dedicated to broadening access to educational opportunities for youth in music and the musical arts. Please visit mbird.org to donate today.
All right, Construction and Engineering Hall, how we feeling? It is 4:30. That's what's going on. This is session 4B, expanding exponentially like some recursive virus, public and personal health. I am your humble moderator, Isaac Sloan, and I am delighted to introduce Andy Garrett. Andy is an EMS and disaster medicine physician with a background in public health and a penchant for music that elevates the human spirit. Along with the long history of frontline disaster and emergency response, he is now a faculty member at the George Washington University, where he runs their Academic Emergency Health Services undergraduate program. His paper, Plague, Pandemics, and Phish, the Public Health Curveballs Continue. You'll hear from him for 20 minutes, and then there will be 10 minutes for a Q&A, and I will disappear now so he can give his talk.
All right. Thanks for coming back, guys. How you all doing? Amazing. I'm walking slow, so I have my walk-on music. I got to figure out how to turn this up a little bit because it's a great song. Okay. Well, thank you for the kind intro. About the next 20 minutes, I'm going to take you on a little bit different journey than you've probably been on for the last day and a half. We're going to talk about public health. But first, you got to do your credentials when you're standing in an audience like this, right? So my first show, 1995, the Lowell, Massachusetts Memorial.
Andy, just speak into the mic so we get it all on the recording.
Oh, we're recording. How we doing? Good? The Benefit for Choice, where Gloria Steinem talked for about an hour and a half, and then Phish busted out a huge list of songs. So this is a really meaningful show to me. Number one, I went back and listened to it after a couple years of not listening to it, but like every show was new and has a personal connection to me. Like one of the speakers said this morning, like everyone's got a cat or a dog named after a Phish character. Somebody this morning has a daughter named after a Phish character. I too have a daughter named after a Phish song title. They're older now, had the benefit of taking both my girls to Phish shows. This is Meriwether Post Pavilion a couple years ago, and had that phenomenal experience of expanding the circle and making it a family affair. But to get back to it, we're talking about public health. I've learned so much about musicology and pedal sustains and all this great stuff, but I don't speak a word of that. I'm just here to nerd out on Phish stuff. But I want to teach you about public health a little bit for the next 15 minutes or so. So talk about public health. Public health is the health of communities, however you decide to define community, right? So our community is pretty clearly a community. We've established this, right? We are leaning on an even stronger word often, like family, but we're big. So community, however you want to define a community, everyone who's got something in common, taking care of that group, that family, is what public health does. And that can be the Phish community, it can be the global community, or anything in between. Okay, the last time maybe you were subjected to me talking to you at the Phish Studies Conference was about 5 years ago. So the last time we were together, I told you about how a public health emergency led to the last-minute cancellation of the Curveball Festival. As a doctor, I like to think about things like anatomy. I gave you an anatomy, a morbidity and mortality report on Curveball. So in case you forgot what happened for Curveball, here's what went down. Phish Festival scheduled. Phenomenal plans to have a great time. Mother Nature ensued. Large quantities of rain fell in the days leading up to the festival, resulting in muddy conditions. These muddy conditions also affected the water source for that community. The turbidity of that water increased. When the water's like that, you can't tell whether there's poo in it. right? Poo in the water is a bad thing for a public health person. And sued, do not drink, water not potable. The festival lost its access to potable water, and although the band tried, they busted their butt to try and figure out alternative means to bring in enough clean, potable water, it did not work. A boil water orders was issued, which made it essentially impossible for the festival to continue. The permit was canceled, and we were sad. Right? We were just talking about beforehand. I remember my best buddy Ted and I had schemed for weeks and months to do this. We had all the supplies in the back. We were like everybody else 10 minutes from the gate when we got, we started seeing this stuff. And what a horrible day that was. We were all crying in the gas stations. If you were there, you remember it. So anyway, a weather event led to a public health emergency, which led to the appropriate but unfortunate cancellation, costing tens of millions of dollars to the region and displacing tens of thousands of fans horribly and inconveniently. But as it turns out, that was not going to be the last time that public health would play a hand in affecting the live music experience we all share for Phish. 2019. We collectively recovered from Curveball a little bit because we had something next on the horizon. A week before Dick's, public health ensued again. Got a notification that my beloved camping on those lush green fields, which is the greatest Phish experience I've ever had in my life, camping with a couple thousand friends I don't know, on the order of the Tri-County Health Department, that was canceled, subsequently never to return. Here we go again. What happened? Camping was canceled. Holy shit, it was from plague? Yeah, plague. You've heard of plague because it killed most of Europe in the 1300s. Right? Plague. This one. Plague killed most of Europe in the 1300s. So you'd think maybe it would be gone by now. But it's not. Plague is still around. It's caused by a bacteria called Yersinia pestis. Causes pneumonic and bubonic plague. What advantage do we have? We have antibiotics now. So you shouldn't die from plague in 2024, right? If you don't get those antibiotics, still about a 30% case fatality rate. You don't want this. Highly lethal if not treated. So what happened? Plague still exists naturally. It's sort of in homeostasis between rodents and fleas in remote parts of the western United States. It's a thing. We just don't hear about it very much because until recently, we don't really see it bumping into the human population. But when certain conditions occur, infected fleas can target non-rodents, including humans directly, or more popularly, dogs who go screw around where the gopher or the groundhogs. The prairie dogs hang out. They can get infected or bring ticks back to your bed where you're snuggling with your dog. Or if you're unlucky enough to have a cat, cats will just die from plague. They'll get it and die. They're very susceptible to plague. So this could be our own behavior, like putting animals, humans, etc., into proximity with the prairie dogs. It might be due to the prairie dogs moving their habitats, or it might be a change in the numbers of prairie dogs, bringing that disease closer to us. But legit, they called it bubonic plague on the Tri-County Health Department's plague warning. They were not pulling any punches. So now, we're 2 for 2 summers in a row. Public health advancing our live summer scene, my live music summer scene. Fortunately, the show did go on, and they were spectacular. But again, inconvenienced thousands, cost me a ton of money, and trying to find a hotel around Commerce City with a week to go with a bunch of thousands of other people, I don't know if anyone else was in that boat, sucked, okay? So it was a memorable crisis. The next year, COVID appears on the world scene. Likely, we're not going to get into that, likely a zoonotic spillover event means comes from animals into humans. There's bunches of diseases that fit into this category. Similar to SARS from before that, and MERS, which are versions of coronavirus spillovers that happened that didn't see explosive spread, COVID-19 appeared on the scene in 2019, but this really represented the perfect storm of public health. And it evolved into a global pandemic because the virus picked up characteristics that essentially meant that every single human being on the planet was susceptible to it. That is the conditions that are required for pandemic spread. We're not going to get too far into the biology of this today, but just let's leave it at, over those couple of really miserable years, there were 700 million cases estimated of COVID. About 7 million deaths around the globe. This was a legit, bona fide pandemic. Just like in 1918, just didn't have the same case fatality rate. But it changed the modern world as we know it, no doubt, right? And again, I'm not trying to diminish the global impact here. This impacted so many people in such a serious way, but we're talking about Phish community today, so I'm going to focus it down. But I got to acknowledge, we all lost friends, and there's people who are still suffering from long COVID, right? We don't really exactly know, going back to that, we don't really exactly know everything that happened physiologically during COVID. But suffice it to say, many people are going to suffer the rest of their lives with some sort of continuity from that disease. Okay? We're also talking earlier about Toronto and one of the Phish shows that got canceled from weather. This is not that show, but up until 2020, only a small number of Phish shows that ever bona fide been canceled. Best I could find was about 9 cancellations from 1983 up until Curveballs. So these guys really want to put on a show. They are in our corner. So roughly 0.5% of shows were canceled for any reason up until Curveball. COVID for sure, we already talked about Curveball, but COVID for sure pulled the rug out from under the live music scene, including our live music scene. Phish was no exception. Over 30 shows canceled, modified, or postponed due to COVID. This is what it looked like. This is what it looked like. But we were not alone. Hundreds of festivals, concert tours were canceled in 2020 and 2021. And the sad part is, a lot of bands and musicians didn't survive. Didn't have the resources to be able to struggle through that without income from live music. So we lost a lot of talent during that time, hopefully to reconstitute and come back in another way. But I've got to give you one bright side, right? And this has been well covered in the conference already. So much great stuff happened because of the resourcefulness and the resilience of the band we're here to talk about, right? So they became essentially pandemic responders in their own sense and brought us stability. They brought us peace. They brought us love. They brought us an outlet to get us through it. And that's, a testament to, again, the folks we're talking about today. So, I mean, as you're watching, I know you can think back and you remember that. That's New Year's Eve, of course, and we all, like was covered yesterday, enjoyed the dinner and movie thing immensely. It became this beacon in the week, right? I think it was Tuesday night. It was like the night to just like, I'm doing this for a few hours, and it's my continuity. So, and I just put that on because I think that's hysterical. So, is this a series of unfortunate events? The pandemic made it 3 for 3, 2018, 2019, 2020. We've seen Phish shows now modified or canceled due to public health events. Maybe you've heard something along the lines of that. So are we going to be making a habit out of this? In the last 5 minutes here, I want to connect the dots a little bit. Spoiler alert, the unfortunate events were likely not random, right? We saw a historic infectious disease, plague, blossom into a modern human health threat and force the modification of a festival. Severe weather and heavy rains created a public health threat that canceled Curveball. The spillover of a novel infectious disease, coronavirus, leads to a pandemic which disrupts our live music world and everyone else's. So these were all public health crises, and like most crises, public health or otherwise, were the product of many variables. It wasn't one thing happened and this bad outcome occurred. This was part of a theme. Anybody want to guess what that theme is? One of the parts of that theme are human impact on the planet. So ready or not, climate change, other human behavior is going to be impacting our future of mass music gatherings around entertainment. I'm not saying it's the only cause. I'm saying it's a variable in the mix. So just a quick little bit of background. 2023 National Climate Assessment. Remember we talked about what happened to Curveball? Rainfall amounts have been increasing over the last 100 years. And when it comes to storms, 70%. And this is saying when it rains hard in a storm, the amount of rain that's happened has increased 70%, disproportionately affecting the Northeast. Bring your Gore-Tex. Plague, just one of the many infectious diseases that are influenced by climate change. So emerging infectious disease, the 2019 situation in Colorado was due to a bunch of variables, some of which are ours. Human behavior, putting houses where the rodents used to live and bringing their pets with them. In public health, we call that incidental hosts. The fleas aren't looking for us, but they're not going to say no. Okay? Climate change, causing prairie dogs and fleas to expand their habitats closer to where we are as humans. Also, weather can increase flea activity, and rodent populations are dynamic and depend upon the amount of vegetation and how much energy they can have to reproduce and grow. So this is all tied in with each other. Who's been going to Dick's for a long time? Remember back in 2011 where you could camp somewhere out here, and when you look out beyond the pampas grass, you know what I'm saying, the largest public bathroom in the world, there was nobody looking back at you. Right? In 2011. What happened? Somewhere around 2014, 15, you'd sneak through the pampas grass to maybe, take a moment for yourself, and there's houses looking back at you. That was all where prairie dogs lived before. So where are the prairie dogs now? Guess what? They're under the soccer field. They're under your car in that little lot with all the holes in it, right? With all the ankle breakers, right? In 2019, there was also environmental stuff going on. It was a partial El Nino year, often leads to warmer, wetter conditions in Colorado, which was the case in 2019. Colorado's right here, warmer winter, El Nino. We're not going to get into it, but you've all heard of El Nino. El Nino is driven in part by human activity on the planet. Both of these conditions, warmer and wetter, likely cooler than warmer and wetter, likely contributed to the plague cluster at Dick's. The pandemic, also influenced by human factors, environmental change. Zoonotic disease and spillovers are about bringing animals, vectors, humans in proximity in larger numbers, right? And we could talk for a whole semester on what happened in pandemic for COVID. We're not going to get into it too much right now, other than COVID's only one of a long list of candidates that are possible for spillover that could cause massive public health crises moving forward. So climate change expands the range of disease-carrying vectors like mosquitoes and fleas, bless you. Remember Zika? Ever heard of malaria? Like a couple years from now, 10, 15, 20 years from now, the malaria mosquitoes are likely going to be covering a good chunk of the southern United States. We're going to be having to learn new things in medicine and public health to deal with new, old diseases. And human behavior, right? This is a hard list to take on, but population growth, globalization, meaning you can be anywhere on the planet 30 seconds from right now, exaggeration, but you can literally be anywhere on the planet a day and a half from right now, from right here in Oregon, right? So infectious diseases have the opportunity to get anywhere on the planet before you even realize you have it. That's how Ebola showed up in Texas. Right? This is a brave new world for us. Increasing population, urbanization, habitat disruption, globalization, climate change, and human behavior are major variables. So spoiler alert, we kind of own the problem here, right? So, Phish and public health. We get it. Phish has a great relationship with public health, and they have a strong partnership, even if it's behind the scenes, to keep us safe as the family. I'm not angling for a job here per se, but I'm not angling for a job here per se. But public health has always been a quiet little part of the concert and festival experience. You see it in the way that, after the first couple of years of doing something like Dick's, they actually had enough porta potties and a place to wash your hands. Like, we appreciate that we lived through some pretty rustic conditions early on in the Phish scene, and that gradually got better because we don't want a Norwalk virus outbreak at Dick's because then we won't get to do it again, right? So it's in our best interest as the family to take care of ourselves, to take care of our community. But beyond just the traditional hand washing, water purity, et cetera, public health role, I want to challenge us to think a little bit more broadly. Partnership and stewardship of our scene requires global citizenship, because if we're going to keep doing this, we got to fix the stuff that's going on that's external variables that's impacting this, right? So if you're looking for a reason to engage on climate change, protecting our live music scene is a great one, okay? That's my message for you guys today. A couple minutes on public health. This is my old car, but it's my favorite license plate ever. And nobody really ever got that, but it made sense to me and I thought it was hysterical. So I don't know if we have time for any questions or anything, but...
Yeah, we do. We have some time for some questions.
Cool. Don't feel obligated, but I'll take my best shot if you have any questions. If not, we're going to have some time at the end too.
I have a thank you and a question for you.
Sir.
I would like to thank you for taking us through such serious material with a lot of relevant information and also good spirit. And I guess a question I have is, in that vein, what is it like to work with material that is very sensitive, very scary, and relevant to all of us, and yet posit it and share it in a way that isn't so terrifying, gruesome, and potentially off-putting and upsetting?
That's a great question that I've never been asked before. But it comes up a lot. So I spend a lot of time briefing people. So in my intro in 2018 when I did this, I've had sort of an interesting trajectory professionally, which included a very senior level position with the United States Department of Health and Human Services. I worked on President Obama's National Security Council as their global health biodefense guy for a year. So it's a really interesting question because you have to be really balanced. You have to, when you're touching the government side of the house, you have to transcend the politics. Public health becomes very political very quickly because inherent to politics is this distaste of talking about risk. And public health requires that we engage on risk in the very, very long term, right? Save the planet, save the scene kind of stuff. But politically, it's much more likely that you're going to see someone roll the dice and be like, hey, can I possibly get away from talking about this for the next 4 to 8 years, and maybe it won't happen? Darn it, the pandemic happened, right? So in terms of that, my job when I work in this space and when I'm advising or briefing senior leadership in my previous hat, and now when I'm teaching students, I want everybody to just be able to talk about it. It's like when you're a doctor and you want to talk about reproductive health or STDs or something, right? You have to take the stigma away from talking about risk. We face enormous risk from public health. Like, worse than nuclear bombs, worse than anything else. The viruses are going to get us in the end. That's how we are going to die as a species. 100% guarantee it. You can book it right now. But, do we look at it that way? My opportunity when I was working at the White House was for the first time. We were looking at public health crises through the same lens that we look at our strategic national security adversaries, and bringing the same machine and the same ability to access senior leadership in the departments and agencies in West Wing to talk about this kind of risk. Right? So one of my jobs was I got to help write the pandemic response plan that ended up getting thrown out, but bygones. But that was the politics part of it, right? My job wasn't to deal with politics. My job was to make sure that we're positioning our country and our citizens to do the best we can and position the globe to do the best we can. Did politics ensue? Absolutely. I ended up losing my government job because of it, through no fault of my own. It's just I was a victim of politics. And that's okay. Now I teach, and it's just as fun. So I hope that answers your question. It's, I think we just have to take the stigma out of talking about risk. We have to acknowledge that these risks are here, just like we talk about tornadoes, just like we talk about anything else. Pandemics, plagues, all this kind of stuff is a reality that's out there. It is a very clear and present danger. And the more we can science it up and acknowledge that this is something we are empowered as human beings to do something about, but we have to acknowledge that we're at risk first. Thanks. Sir.
Hi. Matthew Lynch. I have a quick question. It's yes or no.
Oh, boy.
But it's dependent on if you were hired.
Sounds like I'm in court now.
If you were hired by Phish as a health advisor, public health advisor, would you have advised them to return to touring as soon as they did after the pandemic? Thank you.
That's a tough one. Yeah, it's provocative. It is provocative. Maybe. Again, part of, and I'm not trying to diminish the answer. There was no right answer for that, right? It's if you didn't say yes at some point, you could find a reason to say no until now, right? And there was a continuum of comfort level with returning to public gatherings. And the good part is no one was being forced to do it, right? So as part of that, people had to acknowledge their own risk and their own comfort level and their own desire to get back to the scene. And are they willing to either throw caution to the wind, or are they willing to go dance their butt off with an N95 mask on? I took the latter approach. It was weird, but it worked for me. It got me back to the scene as fast as I could get back to it, because that was one of the things that grounds me. Okay, I didn't really mean to diminish your question. There is no good answer to that. I think they took a provocative approach towards that, and I think they did the best they could. Remember when we were at Dick's and we had to get the wristband and all those types of things? It wasn't done lackadaisically. It wasn't done haphazardly. They mitigated as much risk as they could with the understanding that you could never get it to zero. Thank you, sir.
if it's okay.
Yeah, we have time.
I'll be quick. So first of all, thanks. My wife is in public health, and I thought this was really, really fun.
Pass along the thanks to her.
Absolutely. No, and she wants to hear all about this too. So, one thing I wanted to ask is, what sort of things in Delaware should we be aware of and worried about given this trend? Like, is Lyme disease the thing? Like, what is keeping you up at night about any particular festival, let alone Mockingbird?
Yeah, that's a great question. And like I always tell my friends, virologists don't sleep at night because they worry about this kind of stuff. I am not a virologist, so but that's a great question. I'm going to rephrase it as to how am I going to think about my personal situation going to Mondegreen? And I haven't bought my ticket yet. I'm still holding out for Glenn Close tickets, so if anyone wants to hook me up, just please. So when I approach a festival like this, I acknowledge sort of the same way I would do in any mass gathering right now. My personal preference is that I'm a firm believer in vaccinations and the protection that comes along with them. So I think anytime you're in a crowd like that, not just COVID vaccinations, but appreciate that measles is making a huge comeback. Lyme disease, you kind of tick area, you're just kind of waiting to prevent yourself from getting exposed. Is that an endemic area? Yeah, probably. So would insect repellent be smart? Absolutely, right? You mitigate your risk where you can do it. You don't have to be scared. You don't have to wear a hazmat suit. But the same reason as a doc, I would tell you, you should probably put sunscreen on every day. You should probably put bug spray on every day. You should probably check thyself for ticks when you go to bed at night, right? That's just part of festival living when you're sleeping on the ground. Just like I'm going to tell you, you should wash your hands before you eat and try and keep yourself as hygienic as possible so you don't get any of the long list of diseases that love to hang out where people are in unsanitary conditions. Being on festival tour doesn't have to mean unsanitary conditions unless you want it to be. People make that choice, right? So there are ways you can make tour a relatively hygienic experience. And even that bottle of hand gel makes a big difference, right? So I think about it incrementally. How do I modify my risk? I'm never going to reduce my risk. I'm never going to eliminate my risk. Could I get Lyme disease from going to Mondegreen? Yeah, probably. Am I still going to go? Absolutely. Right? And that's sort of how I live my life. Mitigate risk where I can. Did I answer your question?
You did. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you guys for your time.
All right, thank you, Andy. I will see you at Mondegreen. Next up, we have Amanda Cadran, PhDJ. She is an education researcher, DJ, and certified music nerd. She is the host of the music podcast, All That Jam, which is focused on artists and industry professionals in the Jamband's community.
All right. Just grabbing a couple of things here. How's everybody doing? Now, in a departure, maybe, from your experiences so far, you're all going to need a device in the next couple of minutes. So I want to see that thing in your hand, your lap, whatever you got, because I'm going to ask you a couple questions here. Okay, so just be ready for that. All right, let me pop this open. Uh-oh. More. Let's see. Perfect. Okay, let's get started. I'm so excited for this. Totally. Well, thanks. I appreciate that. All right, so I'm going to go over here. This, for me, is a topic that I never expected to be talking about. So the fact that I'm even here doing this is incredible for a number of reasons. So I'm here to talk about some research that came about completely unexpectedly through my work as a podcast host. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that happened. This is going to get into maybe some different perspectives of a very specific part of the COVID-19 era, if we want to call it that. So as we're listening today, just know, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, I realize this is a very heavy topic. It's something that affected all of us in different ways. I'm going to try to be as sensitive to that as possible as we go forward today. Oh, and there's all my stuff at the bottom. I think I put it at the last slide too. Okay, so here's what I'm attempting to do with this research. We know that there are so many artists that fall under that Jamband's umbrella. Some of them consider themselves to be part of the jam band scene. A lot of them say, I was adopted by the jam band scene and never really expected to be here, but guess what? You all pay my bills, you love what I do, so yeah, I'm into it. So when we talk about jam bands, just to level set with you, that's a pretty amorphous term, right? It's funk, it's bluegrass, it's jamgrass, you name it, it's a lot of things. So we're not gonna actually be talking about Phish today. We're gonna be talking about other members of the scene. And what I'm attempting to do is to take a whole bunch of data, which I'll talk about, and put some meaning around it, put some frameworks around it. And what we're specifically looking at is the time period from March 2020, a couple things were going on in the world then, through about January 21, okay? And how that ultimately affected artists and industry professionals' views of their own creativity and how productive they were during that time. So I'll have plenty of samples and to show you and kind of how this came to be. So this approach really forced me to think about how are we going to break down kind of the different groups of people, okay? So we have musicians who, prior to COVID, were touring full-time. That's their job. That's what they do. And then you've got artists who primarily work out of the studio. They're in recording sessions, maybe not on the road, but they are full-time musicians. And then, of course, you have your marketing professionals, people who are managing bands. You know, there's those industry pros. So we kind of broke it down into those three categories. That's me. I think half the fun of being here is getting to show these pictures. And any education conference I go to from now on, if I can't do this, I'm going to be so disappointed. That top left chick there, she was having some fun in the 90s. So I'm from New Jersey. I live in Denver now. And actually, I have a sticker. It was a Page Side Plague Side sticker from 2019 Dix that I still have. So I remember those days. I have never been able to combine my daytime work as a researcher in education. I work with school districts and states. I help them understand if all the technology they're purchasing is actually helping their kids. But that has always been completely separate from anything I do with music. And I've done a bunch of random stuff with music. But for the last couple years, I've hosted this podcast. And we have, you'll see in a few minutes, we've really been able to talk to a lot of people. I worked in radio, going back to the late 90s. That was actually what I wanted to do. I don't know what happened. And this, of course, like so many of us, right, is our lives. So being able to put this together for the first time for me has been incredible, and I felt so supported in all that. A little bit about the podcast. This is what it's called, All That Jam. We are so fortunate through the work that we do, and it's really just for the fun of it. Nobody's getting paid. We put our time in to do this because we love it, and we have talked to a lot of people. So we have over 450 episodes to date. Last year alone, what does that say? We conducted over 100 interviews, and so there's a lot of information that I'm drawing from potentially to do this work that I'm about to talk about. And so what you're going to see today is like a little piece, a little preview, because what I'm trying to figure out is it worth taking the time to continue exploring this topic? So this is not a completely finished, published type of thing. It's exploratory, which is actually really fun. Yeah, I wanted to just mention this. I said a little bit about this at the beginning, but I think it's really important. We all bring with us our shared experiences, and that, of course, includes this time period. And so today, as we talk about some of the net positives that people feel this era brought them, we also do that with full recognition that there is a lot of heavy stuff associated with it. So I just wanted to let you all know that I understand that, and thank you for, coming to this with an open mind as well. All right, here's the fun part. I would like you to think about if there were any benefits. Now, that's a broad term, okay? So this is the participation part. This is where you can get out your devices, and hopefully this works. Think about it. It's been enough time now, right, for a lot of people to be able to say, what did I learn about myself during those really crucial first months, that first year. And I have some examples I'll pop up in a second that I pre-populated, just a few. So this could be personal, professional. I think you can submit a bunch of different answers, but I'm just curious to know what might come to your mind, because we're going to be talking about what some artists and industry folks have said as I've talked to them. It's the biggest QR code I've ever seen. It's massive. Is it working for anyone? Anyone get in? Yeah. Technology. So I'll give you all a minute to do that, and then I'm going to hop over to the page that should show us your answers, and we can take a look at those and see if there's any themes that emerge from that. Ooh, I see a bunch. Nice work. Good. Oh, I should also mention I was a middle school teacher for 12 years, so I apologize in advance. I love to make people do things. So there you go. All right. I'm going to go ahead and switch over so that we can start to see the answers as they're coming in. Let's see how that goes. Ooh, look at that. Okay. Nice. All right, let's talk about these just for a minute here. And hopefully you can see your answer. I don't know how many it actually, 26. All right, we'll make sure we can try to get to those. So I had put a couple up there just as starters to see if that would help. Does anyone see any responses up here that either surprise you or relate to anything that you feel? Just kind of raise your hand. Anything kind of common that you're seeing that you're like, oh yeah, that kind of works for me? Just seeing if anything's relatable. Okay, awesome. So more time with family. I like that personal growth because that can be so many things. Learning, right? Learning, growing, that's definitely something we hear. The fact that we're able to, I think, put that into words at this point shows us that we are maybe far enough out of that kind of situation to be able to examine these things. So I appreciate you all for sharing these. And if you have any more, feel free to put them in there. The Better with Technology one, thank you, whoever shared that, because that's something that is coming up a lot in my conversations with artists as well. We'll see that in a minute. But yeah, this is great. I'm not sure if I can scroll down to see the rest, and I'm afraid to mess things up. So I'm going to go back here. But thank you for doing that. Okay, we know about music, all right, but I thought I would be curious to know what the Berklee College of Music says. So they have this whole website for careers. And I'm like, all right, well, I guess we should go to the source, right? So I just found some of this really interesting in terms of how I even think of these categories. I think a lot of musicians would not necessarily call themselves free-spirited, but this is what Berklee says, right? So I was trying to put kind of a little bit of a structure around all the different people that we talked to for the podcast. So here's one of them. Here's another one, right? So what I like about these is it helps us with adjectives, with how we would think about these people who have made music their career. And then industry professionals. So, and just to kind of expand on that, sound engineers, we talked to a lot of people who are behind the scenes doing this work, sometimes for decades upon decades, so that kind of thing. So here's the research question. And we did try to limit this to artists who said, yes, I would kind of identify as part of this scene. Very few people tell us, no, I absolutely would not. I do have a funny story about MMW. Maybe I'll tell it if we have time. They do not. We can maybe talk about that later. And so this is not quantitative at the moment, okay? This is really qualitative information coming from conversations. And if you remember from a couple slides ago, we have over 400 episodes. That's not 400 different people. It's probably about 300. In the time I had to prepare, I was able to get through about 70 interviews, so 70 different individuals. I tried to break them down into these categories so you can kind of see where they fall. And then a few demographics. There's a lot more we could say. One thing I will mention up front is this is not a representative sample of the world at large. These happen to be interviews that I already had conducted. COVID. So I'm going to get into that as well. But most of the people that we talk to have had years in the industry. Not everyone, though. Okay. A few of them had not published anything before they actually talked to us as well. And it's this kind of research. So we went into this just having some great conversations. And then after, I don't know, a dozen, 15 of these conversations where whenever COVID would come up, we were getting these responses that were so rich and they were so full of gratefulness and this kind of humble thanks that every single time when we would wrap up these conversations, I would kind of reach back out to my buddy Kevin, who's my co-host, and say, like, what is this? I never would have expected to hear such kind of positive responses from people whose careers were completely thrown off, right? This feels like the exact opposite of what I would have ever assumed musicians would say about how COVID-19 affected them. Because we know the story. We know they couldn't tour. We know that they were losing money. But at the same time, that's not what they were telling us when they were asked, how was pandemic for you? Can you tell us about it? They didn't go there. They actually went to a completely different place. And so as time went on, we said, well, we should probably ask this question more often. And then we start talking, we have 50 people, right? And we have these very similar answers. And that's when I started thinking, I would really like to dig into this a little bit more. So we did not set out to actually do any of this work that I'm sharing today. But what I think it does is show, number one, that even at something at the scale of COVID-19, there are going to be these unexpected blessings, if you want to call it that, these moments that no one could have ever anticipated. So in terms of how I actually got to where we are today, for qualitative research, especially when you're talking about interviews of that number, I developed a content analysis framework, and some of the units are here, not all of them. Basically, you transcribe. There are processes for going through and identifying themes or patterns, and these were some that came up, you can see kind of pretty regularly. So the album release part is kind of what tipped us off originally, because there seemed to be a lot of music coming out around 2022, 23. Some of it had been written pre-pandemic, but needed to be mixed and mastered, right? So there were various stages of creation that a lot of these recordings were at. Of course, just having the time to sit and get some lyrics out on paper or, write some new songs, that is definitely something we heard a lot of. But then the ones that I bolded, I wanted to just focus on a little bit. So this whole idea of practicing, and I'm not going to use any names because really as exploratory research, we didn't go into this with agreements for people to sign or anything like that. So to respect everyone's privacy, I will not say who these folks are, but bassist from a very well-known jam band said that in 25 years of constant touring, I have never had the ability to sit anywhere, whether it's my house or somewhere else, for hours every day and hone my craft, and I am playing better now than I ever have. And I can tell you, this particular band sounds so good these days, and they are energized. They are thinking creatively about how they're selling their tickets and where they're playing. I mean, so there's these spillover effects also of feeling confident in what you do and this re-energized love, right, for it at the same time. So within all of these different kind of buckets, there's even more that is yet to be explored, and as you can tell, that's kind of exciting to me. Resilience, being able to take a situation that is so unknown and terrifying, okay, especially for people who make their living being where they can't be. The ability to adapt and overcome these scenarios with different techniques and processes, or just simply emotionally and cognitively to be able to say, okay, I can process this, I can keep going. Incredible. And none of these artists were kind of thinking that they were going into this process for me to analyze them. So they were really just talking very authentically, from their experiences. But in some way, that flexibility piece was mentioned in the majority of the interviews that I had a chance to code. And then the creativity piece. I mean, how do you make a record when Two people are in the US, but thousands of miles apart. Someone's in the UK. You know, how do you do that? Just the sharing of files, the ability to use different programs and technology to make records. People recording parts of songs that no one else heard until it got to the guy who's mixing it. I mean, incredible things. And then they're saying, oh, I never would have ever considered doing that before, but you know what? Going forward, there was actually something really cool about not knowing, you know, what our guitarist was going to do. And so people had to open up their minds to different ways of doing things. Oh, and I should mention, Otter AI, I just wanted to be kind of open about this, is the program that I use to import all of the files. I'll show you an example, like a little screenshot of some of the work that it does. I would not be here today if it were not for that, I can tell you that. Oh, and here's one. Okay, so this is an example of, it says here a summary. Yeah, it'll take whatever gets ingested, it will process the transcript in its entirety, but then it's going to give this kind of thing, which is really, really helpful. And so I think next I've got some information about what the quote was or what was actually said. But I mean, this is pretty powerful, even that, you know, improvising helped me cope with my fears about COVID. So even just the process itself, regardless of what came out of that playing, is perhaps therapeutic, you know, for a lot of these artists too. Can you remind me how much time I have?
Like 6-7 minutes.
Perfect, thank you, sorry. All right, this is a ton of words. I'm so sorry. This goes against everything I learned in education school. However, I did not want to choose the words for you to see. I wanted you to see all the words. And so I wanted to put some of the questions also when it was kind of really applicable, because, again, we weren't looking to find anything. We were just curious people and music fans. So this is the musician that you just saw the summary of in the last slide. Professional clarinet player, has worked with a ton of people that we all know and love and listen to. Is based in the Northeast, has been playing for a long time. And I thought this was really, for me, very powerful and also very surprising that in this case, and maybe I will just read part of it, but this about face, you know, that I ended up doing something completely different with my music practice than I had ever done before, because I literally had no other choice. And then he says, you know, I wanted to feel some sort of mercy in the universe and in life and feel something beautiful. And weren't we all kind of looking for that at that time in our own way? He was able to get that from something he's been doing for decades, but he had to completely reinvent his method for how he saw his craft. And I thought that was pretty cool. All right, so now we have a touring musician, someone that's out on the road a lot. This person does not have a full-time band. It's somebody that tends to kind of go out and play with a variety of different projects all the time, so knows a ton of people in the industry. And here he's talking about some music that was written before the pandemic, but he wanted to record it. And everyone's at home, so what do you do? And so what he's saying is here, he reached out to all these different people, he reached out to the record label, sent them some of the initial tracks, just what he had put together. And then he's like, well, let's get, you know, this group, let's figure it out. They sent their tracks back to him, right? So they're all doing this remotely. No one is in the same place. No one is actually ever physically in the same room together. And as people tend to say now, that was a pandemic thing, right? That's kind of what we did. It was remote, and also they have a video of each of them doing their tracks and what they did and recording that eventually they want to put together so they can kind of splice it up that way. This one I'll remember for a long time. So this was a jam band who had literally just finished putting out their first album. They were so excited. It had taken them a really long time to get to that point. They were starting to get some support gigs. They were stoked, and then 2020. And so they talked about this, and this is one of those quotes where you could take it in a couple of different ways. They were being very honest about how quarantine helped them. And so I understand that that's a difficult thing to hear for some people, and they even they quantified it. But for them, they had this captive audience of people that needed things to do, us, right? And so they were able to utilize that and kind of maybe move a couple steps ahead in their ability to do that work as touring musicians, so that when it was time to get on the road, they were kind of ready and they had some things lined up, and they were really, really grateful for that. And so you can hear that when they're talking to us, and they're also kind of bashful about it. And part of this is, you know, when we talk to people, they should be able to trust us to say these things. They had a ton of time together, and yeah, so they credit that time period with a lot. And then this is a music producer who has worked with almost, I don't want to say every jam band, many jam bands over the years. And he was working with a group of musicians out of New Orleans who play everywhere. And during the pandemic, this particular artist, who's very prolific, made 3 separate albums. Like, they didn't exist before, now they exist. All happened within that confines of that time frame. And basically, you had to be able to say, all right, well, I care about this musician so much, I'm going to go ahead and put my money on the line for this. I'm going to take some risks. We're going to do this. And they were a complete departure for that musician, things he had never done before. So it also gave, I think, some leeway to try things that were different. You know, different musical style, different collaborations. You kind of had to be flexible in that way. So just wrapping this up, this is all preliminary information, so just kind of pulling what we can from what we have right now. But as we've talked about, I think that the ability to look back and reflect and be honest is really important, and I'm grateful for everyone that's been able to talk to myself and my co-host on the podcast to do that. This definitely needs a lot more time and energy. There's a lot of research out there coming out about the COVID era, but for some reason jam bands have not gotten the same amount of attention. But you know what? We have spent the last couple of days reaffirming how much we love where we are and what we do and how we support the scene in whatever way that is. So I think it would be awesome to get to the rest of these interviews. And there's a lot more that can be done with the coding techniques. You could actually turn a lot of this into quantitative, like statistical information to see if there's any relationships between amount of time on the road and, you know, their perceptions. I'd love to eventually turn this into a book of stories, because it's about the stories, it's about the experiences and what people took from that. So, like, call me if you know anyone that can help me do that, because this is not my job. I am doing this just because I am fascinated by it, and I love to be able to put information out there. So anyone has any ideas, let me know. I've got an interview wish list that I keep of people that I'd love to talk to. And hopefully, if nothing else, you just find this interesting and maybe a different way to look at something that I know was just so tragic and unprecedented. But within that, there are definitely glimmers of some good things too. So thank you.
Thank you, Amanda. And we have about 5 minutes for questions now.
Questions, thoughts?
We can also save them for the end.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you.
All right. Next, we will hear from Ryan Rashotte, who is an assistant professor of English at Temple University, Japan. Yes, he is in from Japan. And the author of Narco Cinema, Sex, Drugs, and Banda Music in Mexico's B Filmography. You're going to have to tell me about that later. He also plays guitar in Tokyo's best and only Phish cover band. Please welcome Ryan.
Hey, thanks everybody. Since we're sharing stats, my first show was Darien Lake, August 14th, 1997. I met Ken Kesey in the parking lot that day. It was really a life-changing day, a life-changing antelope at the end of the first set. So check that out if you haven't in a while. Okay, I'm going to jump right into this. By his own admission, the Brooklyn-born filmmaker and late-blooming auteur Todd Phillips isn't the most enlightened director in Hollywood. In an interview promoting The Joker, a film that would garner criticism for rehashing plot tropes about the danger of a white man scorned, Phillips lamented that his breakthrough comedy films wouldn't have fared well in Hollywood's current political climate. Go try to be funny nowadays with this woke culture, he challenged Vanity Fair. You just can't do it. Phillips is referring to films like Old School and the Hangover trilogy, the prank-heavy fraternal romps that define the mid-stages of his filmmaking career. But in 2000, 3 months after the premiere of his sex comedy Road Trip, Phillips released another film that could comfortably fit into the category of recantable comedies. This was Bittersweet Motel, a documentary about the Jamband Phish that traces the quartet at a mid-level peak in their own career when their swelling fan base came close but couldn't quite tip the band onto the pop culture radar. If I'm being too hard on Bittersweet Motel, let's talk about that at the Q&A, because I feel like I might be here. But anyway, Bittersweet Motel shares much with Phillips' earlier bro comedies. Substance abuse is celebrated, female nudity spectacularized, and male bonding thematized as the prevailing sensibility. At its most decadent, the doc revels in a frat-style Saturnalia, in which the band and fans come together to get wasted, get naked by the thousands, and as one very stoned fan puts it, to party and have fun and have the best time of their life. When asked about the film in 2019, Phish guitarist Trey Anastasio was blunt. That was a long time ago, and whatever, it was what it was. Anastasio was speaking here before the debut of another documentary for which he happens to play protagonist, a film that seems in many ways the antithesis of Phillips' work.
Ryan, I hate to interrupt, but there's some feedback.
I'm getting that.
We all hearing that? Maybe we could be turned down and you could come a little closer to the mic.
Check,
Is that
check, check.
possible?
Check. Oh, there we go.
That sounds good. All right, thank you.
So Anastasio was speaking here before the debut of another documentary for which he happens to play protagonist, a film that seems in many ways the antithesis of Phillips' work. Between Me and My Mind, directed by Stephen Cantor, follows Anastasio for several months in 2007. Ooh, it sounds like it's getting... Am I too close? Yeah, that's good. Check, check. Okay, that's much better, thanks. Okay, so Between Me and My Mind, directed by Stephen Cantor, follows Anastasio for several months in 2017, a period that sees Anastasio, 11 years sober, busy at work on a new solo album while preparing for an upcoming New Year's concert and dealing with the impending death of a close friend. The confluence of creative and personal challenges leads Anastasio to reflect on life, death, family, friendship, and with a maturity that evidently caught film critics off guard. That much of this reflection occurs through conversation with family members and bandmates furnishes the central irony in Phish cinematography. While Bittersweet Motel is a documentary about Phish that's more or less a film about Anastasio, Between Me and My Mind is ostensibly a documentary about Anastasio that seeks to understand its subject primarily through the relationships he has with others. So my intention in this paper is not to champion the film as a correction to the mistakes of Bittersweet Motel, or to examine how it might rehabilitate the image of Phish and its community in line with more progressive sensibilities. What makes the film unique, and I hope worthy of analysis, is how it anticipates a new genre in the literature of addiction, a post or late recovery narrative that eschews the addict's immediate struggles of getting clean in favor of exploring the long-term quotidian reality of living one's life sober. Recovery can be a difficult concept to pin down. Scholar Trish Travis defines it as a multifaceted, dynamic, and evolving cultural formation. She argues that the various religious, political, and commercial discourses that fuel our understanding of it contribute to its nebulousness as a concept, but also to its persistence in American culture as a popular means of growth and self-fulfillment. In this regard, she defines it as a subculture unto itself. One point of consistency among diverse forms of recovery is that they prioritize the value of a good story. In an analysis of sobriety rhetoric from the 1850s to present, Owen Cannon argues that the recovery narrative is one of the most important modern sources of the perennial trope of redemption in American culture, communicating foundational beliefs about social relations in a democratic society. And whether that narrative manifests itself as an AA drunkalogue, a religious tract, or a reality TV series, certain tropes have emerged to define the recovery narrative in ways familiar to contemporary audiences. In cinema, the drug addict has evolved many forms over the years. In the pre-theatrical cinema of attractions era of film history, kinetoscope machines featured exotic images of Chinese opium addicts interloping in urban America with their dangerous foreign vices, the trope of the foreign menace that persists today in Western narcology. Silent-era temperance-inspired films of the early 1910s set another enduring stereotype of the modern drug addict, that of the white, middle, or upper-class victim whose dalliance with narcotics ends in either salvation or complete degradation. In the 1930s, the moral strictures of the Hays Code shuffled addiction stories out of mainstream Hollywood and into the hands of B-film directors, whose penchant for sensationalism generated the psychopathic, murderous dope fiends of cult classics like Assassin of Youth and Reefer Madness. It wasn't until the 40s with alcohol and the late 50s with narcotics that more realistic portrayals of addiction began to emerge. It's fair to say, regardless of the period, the substance being abused, or the trope being exploited, the most memorable recovery narratives have always tended to be pretty devastating. The phenomenology of withdrawal, in particular, is often presented with a brute mimesis, which, in the hands of a skilled director, can balance the scathing humility exacted from the protagonist with a triumphant sense of closure that rewards her suffering. Not all addiction narratives end in triumph, of course. Films like Aronofsky's Requiem for a Dream take their cues from social guidance films in making addiction as demoralizing as possible, while a film like Trainspotting ultimately casts the addict's recovery and reintegration into consumer society with an ironic and cynical hue. Nevertheless, in recovery narratives based on real subjects, the happy ending tends to win out. This is particularly evident in musical biopics and the books that inspire them. In his analysis of 96 biographies about rock stars, Ate Ankerson found that 82% of these books recount struggles with addiction, a huge number that leads Ankerson to argue that addiction has become a tropological marker of authenticity. It's no longer enough to die at 27. Surviving the horrors of addiction is now the real test of one's rock star bona fides. Furthermore, Ankerson argues that in these biographies, the recovery process assumes one of four narrative structures: the common conversion narrative, in which the addict recovers from addiction and discovers a new self; the slow down narrative, in which the addict learns to moderate rather than eliminate drug use; the cycle narrative that sees the addict roller coaster through rehab and relapse; and the growth narrative, a more individualistic form of the conversion narrative that takes sobriety as a personal and often spiritual quest for self-improvement. Narratively speaking, these templates track closely with the typical AA narrative, whose three-act structure of degradation, transformation, and recovery features similar motifs. Now, given the generic persistence of these four structures, it's not surprising that so few recovery stories take place solely or even predominantly after the initial recovery, in what I'm calling here a post or late recovery stage in the addict's development. One reason we see so few of these stories is because in real life, the line between addiction and recovery is never so clear. Former addicts will attest that sobriety is a lifelong pursuit, that the idea of post-sobriety is chimeric at best. The other reason that post-recovery stories aren't so popular is dramatic. Audiences want to see the addict suffer. It's this suffering that satisfies the narratological desire for character development, to say nothing of a vicarious desire to experience the forbidden accesses of the culture's talented avatars. Most often when we do see stories about former addicts, their dramatic tension comes from the temptation to relapse. Characters like Don Gately in David Foster Wallace's Infinite Jest and Jack Torrance in Stephen King's The Shining take this temptation as a narrative test of will. And F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Crack-Up, the most famous post-sobriety narrative of the modern age, absolves the reader any kind of resolution from the outset. The essays are determined to prove that the sober life is a painful test of living with antinomy, of managing the opposing desires to stay the course and to give in. Now, is there a place in the addiction canon for more hopeful post-recovery narratives? Stories set later in the journey, when drugs and alcohol are no longer the persistent eat-a fix? Beyond verisimilitude, addiction doesn't end in circumscribed narrative patterns. What could such a genre offer a culture that celebrates and indeed craves stories of addiction so compulsively? One defining feature of this genre, I posit, would be a narrative approach that prioritizes reflection on rather than immersion in the recovery process. Traditional recovery narratives are reflective by their very nature. But what they reflect on, often exclusively, are those early stages in the addict's quest for sobriety. The initial dalliances with illicit substances, the trauma of hitting rock bottom, the moment of clarity, etc. In a post-recovery narrative, the tribulations of these early stages need not be represented in detail for the value and gravity of recovery to be experienced as meaningful. In Between Me and My Mind, Anastasio spends little screen time directly opening up about his addiction. Near the end of the film, and for just under a minute, he mentions that personal problems like drinking too much and that kind of thing led to his arrest in 2006. In conversations with family, when his addiction comes up, it tends to be addressed elliptically, sometimes in euphemisms. His mother refers to a period of things going south. His father describes the addiction as a health problem. Anastasio's drug use becomes a focal point in a discussion with his wife, who candidly acknowledges her fear that Anastasio would have died from an overdose. But the discussion resolves happily just a few beats later, with the couple strolling hand in hand along the boardwalk in Asbury Park. A different kind of film may take such cryptic and seemingly perfunctory references as attempts to conceal a trauma that hasn't been properly healed. But the reason these conversations seem sincerely conclusive is because the film also demonstrates at several points how the lessons of recovery have enriched Anastasio's personal and creative life in equally genuine ways. Late in the film, Anastasio describes reconnecting with the members of Phish 1 year after his initial recovery, referring to this reunion as the start of rebuilding the band's life in a much healthier way. That music itself can serve as a creative tool in working through trauma is a lesson of Anastasio's recovery that he draws on in this post-recovery period as well. In the film, he describes how songwriting helped him confront grief over the passing of his sister. And Anastasio spends much time in this film creating a new album, partly, he says, to help him work through a sense of confusion and fear surrounding the imminent passing of a close friend. In featuring many of these new Ghosts of the Forest songs, the film tends to gloss over the lyrically irreverent or jam-heavy songs for which Phish is better known, favoring a soundtrack that is meditative and at times overtly spiritual. Which isn't to say there aren't notes of melancholy. The film's opening montage, for example, sets a dour tone by showcasing concert footage from Phish's 30-year career, replacing the diegetic musical performance with a sparse exequial piano melody. This disjunction between the exuberant footage of the band in action and the melancholic piano suggests a lonesome distance between the group and the self. But this is a distance that the film will ultimately bridge through its musical arc. Over the course of the film, we see Anastasio visit each member of Phish separately to teach them a new song, Soul Planet, that will serve as a centerpiece for their upcoming New Year's concert gag. At the climax of the film, we experience how these solo endeavors achieve a unifying fruition as the band performs the song for euphoric tides of fans, dancing in a kind of literal rendition of the song's Eckhart Tolle-inspired lyrics about a spiritual community powered by the interplay of music and love. I like that image because if you've ever read Infinite Jest by David Foster Wallace, that's exactly what Don Gately looks like, that fan in the audience. Owen Cannon argues that, generically speaking, recovery narratives describe models of transcendent deliverance from woe in communities of mutual support. As such, they articulate a foundational ideal for a new social order, one of transformative social sympathy. While sobriety itself is the unifying goal of recovery, he argues that this sympathetic relational ethic is the foundational virtue of the program. The notion that one's community can serve as a locus of self-understanding and personal transformation is foregrounded in the film, which rarely features direct interviews with its main subject, preferring instead to observe Anastasio in conversations with family, friends, and bandmates. It's a discursive strategy that shares a kinship to AA rhetoric. George Jensen, drawing on Mikhail Bakhtin, notes that the narrative form of AA meetings is dialogical rather than monological. Multiple voices participate in fashioning one's sense of subjectivity. Anastasio suggests something similar in the film when he says, "I don't float through life alone. I float through life with pieces of my father and pieces of my mother and friends. We're part of a tapestry." The film's emphasis on community as a source of selfhood puts it at odds with Bittersweet Motel, which disproportionately features Anastasio as a kind of spokesperson for his community. And this goes back to that earlier irony I mentioned, that Bittersweet Motel is a film about Phish that's really about Trey, whereas Between Me and My Mind is a film about Trey that's equally about his community. And if you want to go full structuralist on this, Page speaks 60 words in Bittersweet Motel and 601 words here. I counted. But unlike traditional recovery narratives that also stress the importance of community, in Between Me and My Mind, the community is entrenched from the outset. It isn't an external source that the addict must discover through the recovery process. Moreover, no longer the struggling neophyte, the former addict in the post-recovery narrative bears new responsibilities for the members of her community, using the wisdom of recovery to assist the newest and most vulnerable. In Between Me and My Mind, this act of service is movingly demonstrated when Anastasio uses his musical talents to comfort a friend on his deathbed and to provide catharsis to aggrieved family and friends in the wake of that friend's passing. In retrospect, post-recovery narratives resemble the later stages in Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, in which the hero uses the wisdom of her apotheosis to serve others, bringing the runes of wisdom back into the kingdom of humanity, where the boon may redound to the renewing of the community, the nation, the planet. Now, of course, it would be fair to argue that recovery is at best a side plot in this film, but the idea that I might be overreading this suggests the final and ideologically the most potent criteria of this post-recovery narrative. Its promise that at a certain point in recovery, sobriety doesn't have to be a constant preoccupation any longer. That one's vital allotment of love, joy, and grief need not be monopolized by the recovery process. That life itself can become richer, more banal, but richer in its banality by embracing the long-term narrative of self-discovery in which sobriety just happens to be a chapter. And I really love the last scene of this film because it illustrates, I think, that richness of banality, so I'm going to close with it as well.
So stay here with my endless street. The moments run together in a winding street. There's nothing that I'd rather do than spend my sunset days with you. Spend my sunset days with you.
Great, thank you.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions for Ryan.
So, one of the things that's always fascinated me about Bittersweet Motel is that right after that film came out, Mike went and made his own documentary about government mule losing their basis, which to me always felt like he was purging the content of Bittersweet Motel and was like, actually, let's make a movie about music, which in some ways Bittersweet Motel just really wasn't. I'm sort of interested, like you talked a little bit about the purge, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about like the way in which the narrative of Between Me and My Mind helps to facilitate some of that. And in particular, I'm thinking about like the way in which that movie sort of is such a slow build, and is actually, you were talking about banality. There's almost something like meditative to it that to me seems to allow that same kind of like, okay, let's purge some of these toxins out. Do you think that that's intentional? Do you think it's more collage?
I don't know if it's intentional, but yeah, thank you. You're absolutely right. I think in some ways that like his actual addiction is kind of analogous in that sense, because the purge is more about dealing with, you know, these emotions he has surrounding the death of his sister and also the impending death of his friend as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess part of my point is that his experience with addiction helped him prepare for that purge in maybe a healthier way than he would have otherwise. Yeah, does that answer your question? Okay, thanks.
So I have a question. It's between me and my mind in particular, you're working with some very sensitive material, and Trey at home, and Trey opening up about addiction. And, on the one hand, it's this film made for public consumption. It was shown in theaters. You can watch it on an airplane. But on the other hand, when you start to talk more about it, it becomes, I think, increasingly more personal to talk about him sitting by his friend's bedside or losing his sister, or these kind of very personal moments. I don't know if you have feelings about handling that material, and it kind of seems relevant to not just this film, but working with addiction narratives in general.
Yeah, great question. To be honest, it's not something I really thought about too much. I just kind of started this project just to come to this conference, essentially, but I would like to develop this into a longer paper that looks for other kind of post-recovery narratives. I would anticipate that a lot of the stories would probably be fictional, so that kind of absolves me of that potential guilt there. But yeah, in dealing with other sort of stories based on real life, or that sort of represent real life in that sense, that is a major consideration. I guess I kind of took that for granted with this particular film because of how open it is from the start and how seemingly okay Trey is with being so open about it. And again, I think that's just part and parcel of having been through this experience and understanding the value of being vulnerable through overcoming addiction in that sense. But yeah, that's kind of a major point of consideration. Thanks. Great. Thank you again.
All right, y'all. It has been an awesome day of scholarship. We have one more paper today. He's going to Vernon down the house. It's Jim Vernon. He is the professor of philosophy at York University and the author of Hip Hop, Hegel, and the Art of Emancipation, as well as Sampling, Biting, and the Postmodern Subversion of Hip Hop, which are both available via Palgrave Macmillan. He recently taught a graduate course on Hegel's philosophy of art and the rise, fall, and rebirth of Phish. It's currently being worked up into a book tentatively titled In a Minute I'll Be Free, Phish, Hegel, and the Beautiful Failure of Aesthetic Emancipation. His first show was 12/12/92, and he has seen every tweezer played in Toronto.
Thank you. As everyone I've talked to knows, I'm missing Trey on stage in my hometown right now. He's playing Wolfman's, I just checked, and so he's playing a tiny half-undersold club. So I'm glad to be here. Let's put it that way. Let's start. As every fan knows, tension and release jams are a Phish specialty and take place when the band and audience are moving through a song together toward an inevitable musical climax. However, as Walter Holland reminds us, to hear what's going on in them, you have to accept that the relationship between tension and resolution won't, and indeed can't, conform to your expectations, which is quite different from what 3-minute pop tunes have taught you is normal, regardless of genre. The need to train fans into this acceptance may help explain why Phish, from their very origin, packed so many different forms of tension and release into every show. For example, in many Phish tunes, the entire compositional construction is all about tension-release cycles of varying lengths. Take Fluffhead, whose opening sing-along quickly shifts into a Byzantine sequence of increasingly tension-raising segments, eventually landing in a hair-raising motif that anxiously grates against lyrics that celebrate life as a bundle of joy. However, a joyous, intensely alive feeling quickly becomes impossible to suppress as the opening chant suddenly bursts through, transformed by the preceding build into an explosively euphoric peak. At the opposite extreme, consider the divided sky pause. Trey has described the pause as an exercise in audience behavioral study, as the pause always results in 3 waves of audience cheers. The first, soon after the pause. The second, about 30 seconds later. This cheer often contains a certain degree of uncertainty and thus builds tension. And the final cheer being the release of that tension for the audience and the cue for Trey to hit the last note and continue back into the song. The last pause is also featured in My Sweet One of the tunes performed on Amplified in the early 1990s. Those of us lucky enough to have caught those shows know well the delirious release that arises from a hyped crowd having to restrain itself in order to hear their bluegrass or barbershop chops. Back then, of course, you also might have been asked to help guide the big ball back to the stage before proceedings could continue, with Fishman mounting our collective anticipation by furiously thrashing his kit until all 3 balls were dunked in the band's hoop. Given their storied history of one-off openers, unique transitions, rare bust-outs, secret language signals, and sudden shifts into story time, Holland is probably right that with Phish, the principle is tension and release at every scale, note to note, bar to bar, through the improvisation, across the whole composition, extending even to the structure of the show, the tour, and the touring year. Arguably, then, it's the continuously flowing waves of tension and release, organically bound together in shows as a whole, that makes the amazing peak of a jam stand out that much more due to all the eeriness preceding it, if I can quote ZZYZX. And as we all know, when those amazing peaks arise, they are quite simply unlike anything else in live music, as the intense, energetic pressure built up in the music and audience alike pours into an oceanic release, to use Dave Thompson's poetic but undeniably accurate phrase. For many fans, these cathartic moments do nothing less than elevate a Phish show to religious heights, eliciting shared euphoria as 20,000 fans revel in the band's exceptional tension release improvisations. These jams also not just permanently shifted the sound, but dramatically increased the popularity of improvising rock. According to former Strange Folk manager Sam Ankerson, Phish didn't invent jam music, but they invented the current formula for it. Really, what they do better than what anyone has is hit the peak, coming back from tension with this 3-chord slamming thing, and then wow, all the lights come on and the place goes absolutely mental. Now it seems really simple because that's what every single jam band does. But that's why we can all survive, because everyone loves the peak. So the question I want to ask here is why? What makes the ratcheting up of musical tension into a peak release so appealing and transformative for band and audience alike? I think multiple theories are possible, but today I want to consider just one, suggested by the work of another fringe denizen of the hills of New England. The psychoanalyst and physician Wilhelm Reich didn't write much about music, save affirming the somewhat common sense view that music gives expression to the inner movement of the living organism, and listening to it evokes the sensation of some inner stirring. In the modern world, however, Reich felt that virtually all expressions of the inner movement of the human organism were fundamentally unhealthy due to a widespread malady that he called orgastic impotence. Orgastic impotence is not to be confused with sexual incapacity. Virtually all the subjects Reich saw and studied in his clinical and research practices were not only sexually functional, but, whether faithfully married or field-playing Don Juans, personally considered their sex lives healthy and satisfying. What Reich discovered in both groups, however, was an obsessive fixation on sex, be it a compulsive drive to shame the sexual antics of others in the name of a moral duty, or a distorted identification of sex with the very practices of conquest and degradation that sexual moralists used as justifying foils. It would thus have come as no surprise to Reich that sexual relations would form the enduringly dominant theme in pop and rock music, from the most mainstream to the most marginal, and that sex would be represented in those songs on a kind of sliding scale between two extremes, one as pure, ennobling, and eternal, and on the other hand as carnal, degrading, and ephemeral, usually with music aesthetically aligned with the lyrical sentiment. The obsession shared across the spectrum, however, struck Reich as fundamentally strange. For all other mammals, he reasoned, sex is a gratifyingly essential, but relatively minor part of life, engaged in at regular intervals to be sure, but subordinate to tasks like finding food, rearing young, developing skills, and challenging the mind and body through varied forms of work and play. For Reich, the fact that today everything revolves around sex is the surest indication that there is a severe disturbance not only in the human animal's flow of sexual energy, but as a consequence of this disturbance in his biosocial functioning, a disturbance Reich named the emotional plague. So from the most prudish to the most libertine among us, Reich argued, our obsession with sex has become so strong that our energy is largely absorbed by it and can't be redirected much to things like focused work or sustained study. Consequently, we remain largely ignorant of and thus uncreative and often helpless within our world, leading us to become contemptuous of ourselves, others, or both. Small wonder, then, that the lyrics and music of much pop and rock primarily expresses the inner states of anxiety, depression, rage, and material greed. By contrast, the near total absence of essentially all these themes in the lyrics of Phish might not only explain why the band, despite decades of arena-filling popularity, remain perennial outsiders in a popular culture obsessed with them. It might also point to both the ground and underlying appeal of their musical focus on tension and release. To see why, we first have to understand what Reich called the orgasm formula. Inspired by Freud's earliest theory of libido, Reich held that in everything living, sexual energy is at work. The presence of energy, of course, can only be recognized through its effects, or its exertion in works which produce movement, action, or other transformations. Sexual energy in the broadest sense was of special interest to Reich because its work characterized living entities, from the most basic activity of cells to our own instinctual and habitual behavior. While human sexual gratification clearly begins with the engorgement of genital tissue, Reich also noted that blood flow alone, for instance as in an erection, does not produce pleasure sensations unless it is also accompanied by an increase in energetic or electrical charge, as evinced by the fact that sexual excitation cannot be commanded or produced on demand, while physical arousal can. Sexual gratification thus presupposed two distinct levels of tension raising: a purely physiological expansion that reaches a kind of natural limit given the composition of erectile tissue, followed by a further heightening of erotic pressure that builds from the concentration of libidinal energy within the genital boundary, which then pushes for an external release. In fact, on closer investigation of the process of sexual function, Reich discovered what he called a peculiar 4-beat pattern. First, the organs fill with fluid, mechanical tension. Second, a further intense excitation via buildup of electrical charge. Third, orgasm, where sexual excitation is discharged through muscular contraction. And fourth, release into a relaxation of the genitals through a flowing back of the body fluids, or what he calls mechanical relaxation. This orgasm formula, I assume, is reasonably familiar to most of us. But for Reich, this pattern defined the basic rhythm of all biological functioning, right down to the process of cell division, wherein the swelling buildup of energy within the physical boundary of the cell leads the walls to stretch to their limit, which is eventually exploded by the pressure of its internal energy, splitting the cell into previously unforeseen forms created by the fluid drawing back and relaxing into distinct shapes, which then begin to rebuild energy, eventually repeating the formula. Reich thus held that what he called the fundamental biological function of pulsation, that is, of expansion through the raising of tension to a culminating peak, and contraction in a blissful post-release period of relaxation, was the fundamental governing principle of life at every level, in its somatic as well as psychic forms, from the microscopic to the macrosocial. Being the most significant biological process, Reich's orgasm formula can be called the life formula. Note, however, that as the resulting division makes palpably clear, the energy in the cell must be raised to a level sufficient for the walls to finally burst, pouring the energy into oceanic release so that the newly produced forms can result. If the energetic tension cannot be properly raised, healthy division becomes impossible. Likewise, Reich reasoned, orgasmic release in the sex act corresponds to the excitement which leads up to it. And for the vast majority of us, his clinical research suggested, full release of stored libidinal energy has become effectively impossible due to endemic forms of sexual malfunction. Take premature ejaculation, where the fourth beat arrives too soon after the first for the sexual charge to build to a level sufficient for a fully gratifying climax. While what we call orgasm is what prevents it, everyone who's experienced it knows that this release entails what Reich calls a considerable reduction of genital gratification. For full gratification presupposes a prolonged friction to build tension sufficient for the concentration of the whole of the free libido at the genital apparatus. A disappointment quite obviously shared by all parties involved. Such partial venting, Reich argued, leaves us with residual libido that, unable to be expressed sexually, returns inward along with the fluid, where its tension-raising energy agitates our physiology. If this happens continuously, it eventually results in a kind of chronic restlessness that can manifest itself as anxiety, depression, melancholia, self-destruction, and other common themes in indie rock and soul music. This may help explain why Phish fans not only viscerally feel, but have actually named the disappointment arising from jams that putter out without true peaks or ripcords. It may also help explain why fans are disappointed in the constant bliss jams of 3.0, because there's no sufficient tension that gets built. Reich's research indicated that insufficient release not only occurs among the great majority of men in our culture, but that it is primarily rooted in the sense of guilt and shame which our morals have attached to natural sexual function. Morals that Reich argued instill in us a kind of physical or psychological armoring grounded in the constitutive fear of embodied joy that can manifest as an early expenditure that wards off the threat of immersing ourselves in true prolonged pleasure. At the other extreme, however, Reich's research also suggested that this armoring can manifest itself as the identification of sexual pleasure with the very shame and debasement attached to it by sexual morals. He saw evidence for this in the images produced by the pornography industry and in the diversion of genital satisfaction to a panoply of fetishes. Rather than immersing us in embodied pulsation, Reich felt, by divorcing pleasure from both natural rhythms and emotional connection, such practices link sex with a kind of cold, thoughtful, and distant control of our bodies, of the bodies of ourselves or others, effectively transforming sex into a matter of conquest, dominance, performance demonstration, narcissism, and other rap, metal, and dance hall tropes. Again, while there are admittedly many exceptions, I think it'd be worth investigating how many fans like ZZYZX do not attend Phish for music that is dark or scary, but prefer soaring, uplifting jams that happen, say, in the peak of a Slave to the Traffic light. Now, while we may question Reich's account of sexual malfunction in many of its details, if music is indeed an expression of the inner states of individuals and their culture, current pop and rock offerings, especially as they present our inner states concerning sex and romance, seem to bolster Reich's general theory that wherever one lands on the spectrum between chastity and debauchery, the frequency of sexual intercourse is not the key element in the prevention of neurotic symptoms. Rather, it was whether the sexual contact produced was completely gratifying, that is, whether all the dammed up excitation was fully discharged. Taking his cue from the rhythm of our cells, Reich argued that such neuroses can only be fully resolved if we return to the natural rhythms of life, or work to overcome our inability to ride out by joyously and fully immersing ourselves in multiple waves of gradually and organically building tension in order to reach the true peak release of what he called the most important criteria of orgastic potency, the involuntary bioenergetic contractions of the organism into the complete discharge of the excitation. The cure for the emotional plague, in other words, lies in the revival of the ancient secret of eternal joy embedded in our very biology. And the trick, as Reich puts it, but all of you know, is to surrender to the flow of biological energy without any inhibition, be it shame-based fear, guilt-laden repression, pornified fetishization, or narcissistic power trip. As he began to revive orgastic potency in himself and his clients, Reich found that the psychological and physical armorings that constrict full release seem, as it were, to split open as a melting sensation sets in, which may best be described as a radiation of excitation from the genital to the other parts of the body. The insecurity, rigidity, and ego-driven character with which we armor ourselves finally gives way to what he calls cosmic or oceanic feelings of connections with their body, their partner, and their world. So to me, the undeniable resonances between Reich's orgasm formula and the Phish experience as described in the first half of the paper suggest to me that the band's tension and release aesthetic could be understood as the musical expression of the inner striving for oceanic satisfaction that we all naturally seek. This is in fact vaguely suggested by Trey, who recalls, "I knew what I was doing with tension and release on an instinctual level, long before I learned the theory behind it. Figuring out why it works in theory simply enabled me how to take it further in practice." Conversely, however, the fact that fans by the thousands cross the country to catch show after show after show after show in search of oceanic release may mark a kind of obsessive behavior that gives credence to Reich's suggestion that this cosmic or oceanic yearning in people is nothing but the expression of their orgastic longing for life. A longing for life we just have not found a way to satisfy outside of shows. Reich, in fact, was deeply concerned that that which links man to his cosmos has as yet found genuine expression only in great works of art, especially in music, and that until now it has not exercised a fundamental influence on the shaping of human society. An influence that could no more be gained by focusing on our sex lives than by building up our show stats. Since it was social conditions and changes that transmuted our original biologic demands into the emotional plague, Reich's primary focus was to instill in all of us the broader drive to redirect our excess energy into work which brings about a more natural, balanced, connected, and thus liberating relationship to not just our own bodies, but our families, our communities, and our world. Thus, rather than directing us to perfect our orgasms, he challenged us to strive to transform our sex-obsessed, plague-ridden culture by consciously investing our excess energy into finding oceanic connection in all forms of healthy and essential work and play, or to understand you're great when you attend lovingly to your trade, when you take pleasure in carving and building and painting, in sowing and reaping, in the blue sky and the deer and the morning dew, in music and dancing, in your growing children, in the beautiful body of your wife or husband, when you go to the planetarium to study the stars, to the library to read other men and women who thought about life. And once again, it's revealing to compare Reich's advice to that offered by both the band and even some fans who have long warned that, great as it could be, too much Phish like too much sex might suggest something unhealthy. In his memoir, ZZYZX warns young fans against striving to become professional tourers, people who just went to shows and did little else, stressing that it's always important to balance tour life with real life, lest both come to ruin. Similarly, Fishman admits, sometimes I ask myself, God, do I really want to be part of something that involves a crowd of people following me around? However, the other side of it is that I've been meeting community-oriented younger musicians striving for a group interaction greater than themselves. I've met a lot of kids who follow us because of the Grateful Dead thing, which seemed to get out of control towards the end, as though the pests had destroyed the cornfield. I suppose at some level, the parasites are unavoidable. But if our music provides something people don't get elsewhere, if it's hitting some kind of creative nerve that makes people want to live a life that parallels what we do musically, then great. If living a life that parallels with Phish's music means living a life in flow with the rhythm of living energy, Reich's orgasm formula helpfully reminds us that while surrendering to the flow is the most natural thing in the world, due to the unhealthy habits encouraged by our plague-ridden culture, it also takes hard, persistent, and tension-building work. However, if we can train ourselves to invest our energy into the often extremely challenging labor of removing the restraints that divorce us from the diverse pleasures of our world, we can come to feel so healthily alive in the necessary work of living that it becomes indistinguishable from blissful play. A life lesson, I would suggest in closing, that is not only exemplified by the unlikely success and astounding achievements of those other fringe denizens from the hills of New England, but is actually encapsulated perfectly in, to me, the most Reichian scene in Bittersweet Motel. So I'm going to give the last word to Trey and Paige.
I'm in it because I enjoy it. I take it seriously. Real serious. Like I can sit here all day and talk about the music. I mean, we don't just, but I take it seriously because it gets me off. You know, so the more seriously I take it, practicing and stuff like that, the more I get off. The more we put in it, the more we get out, the better it is, you know? It's like that thing, pumping iron, the artist talking about looking at. It's like, you know, every time I get on set, it's like I'm coming. And then girls see my muscles and I'm coming all night. It's like all day long I'm coming. You know? And that's kind of how I feel, you know?
Thank you.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you to our panelists. We have been on a journey this afternoon. We learned that bubonic disease, bubonic plague, zootropic disease, that is not what's up, but we have to talk about it anyway. It's important to talk about it. We learned that musicians had a mixed experience of the pandemic and quarantine, and that Amanda is very good at organizing a lot of interviews. We learned that Between Me and My Mind is probably a better movie than Bittersweet Motel, and that narratives of addiction are multifaceted, complex. There are different ways to talk about them. We learned about the biological underpinnings of our love for tension and release jams, and to seek out oceanic states in our lives. So let's give a hand for these panelists. They have been fantastic. Thank you all for listening. We have some time for some questions if anyone has questions for Jim or anyone else.
Thank you for your presentation. I think it's an important thing to put out there, and I'm really curious to see qualitative research on the subject. Have you done any qualitative research? Are you aware of any qualitative research? I mean, I know just from being on female message boards that there's certainly arousal and sometimes climaxing that happens at shows. So I would just be really curious to get some qualitative data.
So no, I don't have that, and like there's little on Reich, and there's a long, confusing story about Reich. It's worth looking into. I only got into it because like it's a weird piece of American history. Like how many people know the story of Reich? The FDA, he invented a kind of therapy where you sit in a box, and the box doesn't really do much. The FDA declared this doesn't do anything. But for the first time, and only time in American history, they declared it illegal to even discuss the boxes in the country. Reich died in prison for talking about his medical research. They burned his books publicly and smashed all of his equipment with axes publicly. This was a Holocaust survivor 10 years after the Second World War ended. Died in prison for talking about what he, I read a book that came out about 5 years ago about the first biologist to go, well, what was he doing? And just went and found the remaining archives and looked at it and was like, it kind of looks like he was onto something. Like, I can't say for sure because we made it illegal to discuss this in the country. But I've seen video I've never seen before. He clearly saw something that I think he misinterpreted. But he saw something that disturbs some foundational aspects of our understanding of how life originated, or how it might have originated, and therefore people just were like, he can't be right. And it's a long story because he was also persecuted by the Nazis and the communists and the capitalists. It's a trifecta, which is rare. So it does look as though the Stalinists were partially behind it, working with the American government. It's a very weird, well worth looking into. But there really isn't any research on Reich that's anything other than by sort of committed Reichian analysts who are few and far between. But since this book's come out, there's at least some, it's on Harvard University Press, it's not like a small book, it's a serious scholarship. And so there's at least some effort to try to revive some of his work. But yeah, somebody else should take that on, because I have no idea how you can begin that process, but it certainly deserves something like that, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I mean really just talking about Phish fans in general and your theory, how it's related. And I'm really interested also in the way that Reich talks about somatic armoring and, how we armor ourselves. I'm a somatic therapist, so, I definitely see the Phish experience as an opportunity to unarmor ourselves. And I think definitely the tension and the release piece is a part of that, too.
Yeah, thank you for that. It's actually like, I'm kind of interested in just Reich's view that this does happen mostly in art. And that might be a problem. Like it may suggest something of like this refusal to confront it because it's out there. It's not my favorite theory of Phish, by the way, of why tension and release works. It's one that struck me, and so I thought I'd talk about it here. But yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Going once? Going twice? All right, so thanks again to the panelists. Thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. Bombs Away Cafe at 8 p.m. There's a fellowship meeting at 6 p.m. or 6:30.